I want to thank Gabby and Igor for inviting me and for you for coming here today. I think it's customary for people invited to give talks to give the same talk over and over again, or to change it a little bit each time. But I've taken this opportunity, and again, I'm very grateful to write something new, and so it's not polished. It's still very rough, and probably would go on for 2 or 3 hours if you let me. But this could be a very short presentation as well, because that's the answer to the question I pose in the introduction, in the title. But I think it's important because it makes anthropology a very crucial part of one of the most important issues that faces us on the planet today. I gave my first paper on climate change and anthropology in 1995, and I remember the occasion because several people told me afterwards that climate change was just a fashion and it would go away, and so I shouldn't devote very much time to it. Anthropology has actually been very, very slow, far behind other social sciences in getting involved in this issue. And I was appointed to this AAA climate change task force in 2011. And I just compare that with the efforts of the insurance industry in the USA. They've been hiring consultants and writing reports since 1998. And we produced a long report. It's available on the internet. But most of the report is devoted to studying the impacts of climate change on people, particularly small marginal groups. And it's not a big surprise that it's mostly poor and powerless people far from the United States that are going to suffer first from climate change. The only two of us in the report who were writing about the causes of climate change and arguing that anthropology is essential for understanding the causes were me and an archaeologist, Lisa Lucero. So that's what I'm going to talk about is the causes, not the impacts and the mitigation of impacts, which is still what most anthropologists are working on. This is how people outside of anthropology think about the causes of climate change. The categories are things like energy production, transportation, goods and services, agriculture, sectors of the economy. And so it's got kind of the input is these sectors like transportation or agriculture, and then on the right side you have the output in carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases. But the important thing about this chart is that it has no people, sin humanos, nor anything about the kinds of human activities that produce these gases. And effectively, when you think about what kinds of human activities are causing this, a lot of them come down to producing goods and services that are consumed by human beings, and also the destruction of those goods and services. And it's important to think about destruction not just because of waste, but also because so much production is oriented towards military, building military forces, a form of consumption that is rarely considered by the climate scientists. When I started working in the area of consumption, the conventional theory was that was what's called the IPAT formula. This was invented by some sociologists and environmental scientists in the 1990s. And basically they argued that the impact of humans on the planet is the product of population size, level of affluence, and the kinds of technology that are being used to create that affluence. Anthropology has been working a lot on population over the last 30 or 40 years, and we found that culture plays an enormous role in mediating population growth and now population decline in some places. But especially in the scientific community, there's been a tremendous faith in technology and the idea that whatever happens with population and affluence, technology is going to fix it. So in the 1990s, we heard a lot of talk about things like decarbonization and decoupling or dematerialization, with the idea that as people got richer, their technology would get more efficient, and people would switch from using goods to using services, and that this would lead to lower and lower environmental impact for each person. And it hasn't happened that way. They've spent the last 10 years trying to figure out why. One surprising factor that they didn't include is that the size of households in most developed rich countries is going down steadily. And what that means is that each person is consuming more goods and services. If you think about a large household, they're sharing the use of appliances, they're sharing the use of air conditioners. As households get smaller and smaller, you get to the situation where each person has their own air conditioner, their own refrigerator, because they're living by themselves. Close to 30% of adults in the USA live by themselves or in an institution. And the Netherlands is the only country where they've really done a good job accounting for this. And they find that the decline in household size has eaten up all of their savings in efficiency over the last 20 years. So it's impossible to separate social and cultural elements from all the activities that lead to carbon emissions. The climate scientists rarely include this important aspect of human population, and that is the tremendous inequality in the distribution of goods and services. If you took all of those goods and services and divided them equally, there would be enough to go around to provide a comfortable and modest but completely adequate diet and shelter and healthcare for every single person. But you would rarely hear a climate scientist address this issue. The only people who have worked on it on a large scale, looking at the influence of inequality on consumption, are sociologists, mostly media sociologists working in the 1990s and early 2000s. And their work was looking at reference groups and the fact that people are always looking to richer and more prosperous people as the models for their behavior. Their idea is that as global media penetrates everywhere, people's reference groups shift from the rich people in their village or in their community to the richest people they see on television, and that this creates much higher aspirations. It's an interesting idea and it makes sense, but it's very difficult to prove. But even that work on reference groups never addresses the real problem, which is why do people consume, and why are they constantly increasing consumption given the opportunity? And when you talk with people outside of anthropology and a few other disciplines, they believe that it's natural for humans to want more because they're increasing their comfort and affluence, and everybody wants to eat more. I always teach that if people say it's natural, it's probably cultural. And in fact, anthropologists have shown repeatedly that there's nothing natural about wanting to constantly increase your own consumption. We've been studying societies for well over 100 years where there are many social and cultural constraints that keep people from increasing their consumption. We see plenty of prehistoric communities where when there was surplus, instead of increasing everybody's, the size of every house or giving everybody better clothing, instead they built giant pyramids and buried vast amounts of valuable goods. Actually, a lot of the fundamental research on leveling mechanisms by anthropologists was done here in Mexico and also here in Yucatan. So this includes things like the fiesta system, the cargo system, class systems that restrict high consumption to a very small group of people, or the complex that George Foster called the image of limited good, which was a system of envy, fear of envy, and witchcraft that restrains consumption in small communities. I saw this working in the Kekchi villages that I worked in southern Belize, 1979 and 80, where everybody wore the same clothes and everybody had the same kind of house, and really nobody exhibited differences in wealth. We should also remember that there's often just direct violence aimed at people who break community rules and norms. The first shopkeeper in one village where I worked stopped making milpa and started building a really nice house, and it mysteriously burned down in the middle of the night. Then when drug money started to come in, it led to a lot of direct violence where people killed each other with machetes, and sometimes that was on this issue of wealth. So this allows us to say it's not natural, and it's not every kind of culture that engages in this kind of mass consumption and endless accumulation. The kind is called mass consumer culture. And these are just some of the characteristics of mass consumer culture as it's been defined by anthropologists and sociologists, and especially historians. The proliferation of different kinds of goods that are available. Social identity that's determined and signaled partially by consumption. A fashion system so that tastes are constantly changing. And also the equation of political freedom and the freedom to consume. And there have been some very prominent social theorists and historians who have drawn our attention to these aspects of mass consumer culture. Over the last 30 years, historians have been arguing about when mass consumer culture started and where it started. A lot of them have focused on the emerging bourgeois middle class in Europe and to a lesser extent in China as the site where this mass consumer culture started. And they argue about why, what the causes were as well. More recently, there are some archaeologists like David Wengrow and Ann Pyburn, who have argued that we can find mass consumer cultures or elements of mass consumer cultures much further into the past. This is what David Wengrow studies. These are cylinder seals interpreted by archaeologists for many years as religious symbolism. Now we're beginning to recognize that they were used to seal containers of wine and oil to attest to the identity of the maker. In other words, they're trademarks. And in early classical times in Europe, each region or sub-region or city had its own particular shape and style of container, again, as a way of identifying their particular product and attesting to its quality. The Romans had a law that you had to break the amphora after it was empty so that it couldn't be used again to ship counterfeit or fake products. This is a collection of Clovis points that were found in, I think, Kansas in the United States. And it's clear here that these are not just utilitarian objects. There was an intrinsic interest in their aesthetics that went far beyond their function. And of course, we have these art styles like what's called Olmec, which again become very widespread and clearly have social and cultural meaning beyond just being a way of decorating pottery. So we see elements of mass consumer culture in a lot of different places. The question is how we got from there to here. This is an American household at the median income, and the photographer Peter Menzel went around the world and had families, take all of their possessions and put them out in front of their house so they could take a picture. My work is really inspired by reading Sidney Mintz's book, Sweetness and Power. His argument was that the emergence of mass consumer society in Europe was closely related to plantation agriculture, slavery, and other kinds of coerced labor in Africa and the Caribbean. And this made possible also cheap industrial labor in Europe. So it's not like European consumer culture develops autonomously. This is already part of a global system. This is another project that I've worked on for a long time, and I'm going to go through it very quickly. The project is on something called binge consumption. And I argue that, again, this is something that originated not in Europe, but in the frontiers and fringes of the expanding European empires. And it consists mainly of taking men and women out of households and putting them into homosocial work groups. So men spent their lives living and working with other men, and women spent much of their lives living and working with other women. And all over the world, starting in the 16th century and going right up to the 20th century, you find a huge amount of labor being done by these sexually segregated groups. The cheap food is something I've written about a lot. It was really the invention of and production of large amounts of salted meat and the shipping of wheat flour, as a ration that could support gang labor. And this kind of describes the characteristics of this gang labor mostly involved in extractive forms of production. So that includes fishing, mining, logging, the kind of immediate destruction of natural resources and conversion into commodities. Here's a group of loggers in the west coast of the United States. These men lived together every day. They ate all their meals together, and they did not see a woman for about 10 months of the year. Again, these are loggers in the northern part of the United States, and they're eating salted pork and bread. So these are fishermen who are making bacalao, and these are sealers who killed hundreds of thousands of seals for their pelt and for their fat. And here's cowboys. Very poor men who spent most of their life in very distant, faraway places doing very dangerous work. What happened when these people got paid at the end of 10 months, or in some cases 2 years of labor? They got their money all at once, and what did they do with it? They didn't invest it in a bank or buy real estate or property. Usually they would buy new clothes, they would get a really good meal, and then they would go get drunk and find a prostitute. So my argument is that gender was a very important and intimate part of the generation of consumer culture. And it didn't just start with the bourgeoisie. It's started among many different groups, far, far from Europe. And the expansion of consumer culture today, marketers still base much of their effort on promoting gender difference. So clothing, cosmetics, food, drugs. This is the work of a Korean photographer. And her work is about how children start getting gendered before they're born. This idea of identity being created through the manipulation of consumer goods is something that we have a long tradition of studying in anthropology. So yeah, there's the complementary photo. And this was not the case even 30 and 40 years ago, that all foods and toys and cleaning products were available in male and female versions. Now we even have different kinds of bottled water for boys and for girls. So far I've suggested, I'm trying to understand this expansive nature of consumer culture, why it is always growing. It thrives on divisions, on differences in gender, differences in age, and differences among regions and places. It also grows because local constraints on consumption are undercut by the state and by mass media. Thorstein Veblen, the sociologist, noted this at the end of the 19th century, that when social order based on occupation, education, and class started to break down, consumption became the primary way that people identified themselves socially. And this has to include some focus on the body and the way that modern contemporary bodies are cultivated through consumption. And several historians have also told us we need to look at health and concepts of the healthy body and how making individuals responsible for their own health has led to constant growth in consumption. I think it's also important to look at the way that time has been rearranged under contemporary capitalism. The anthropologists Mark and Mimi Nichter at the University of Arizona have argued that the way capitalism creates time is by creating a rhythm of constraint and release. So in the morning you work, and then you take a coffee break, and then you go back to work. And then you work all morning, and then you take a break at lunchtime, and then you work again in the afternoon. And this is reproduced at every scale. So you have the weekend, your time of release, or you can look at it as the life course, where you get to play when you're born, and then you go to work, and then sometime, hopefully before you die, you get to relax again. And there's something about this rhythm that is expansive, and it is constantly intensified. So you're working harder and playing harder, as they say in the United States. Time has also been reconfigured with this idea of progress, and a notion that every generation should be getting richer than the previous generation, that it's the duty of children to be successful because of the hard work of their parents. For example, anthropologists have been involved with this notion of progressive evolution of culture for a long time. It seems strange that now I go to meetings and I hear people talking about the next hot topic is, the next hot concept will be degrowth. I hear this mainly from people highly educated who have no idea what life is like for the other 99% of the planet. I don't think they have any idea how powerful the ideology of progressive change really is, especially for the billions of poor people in the world. So now you have rich people in the richest country telling the rest of the world that now we have to give up our idea of progress and start to think about being happy with what we have. So what is the solution to a culture built on expansion and a planet which cannot digest any more carbon dioxide? Our leaders are sending representatives every year or two and making pledges that in the future they will start dieting. And it makes perfect sense that no government wants to tell its people that they have to start to reduce their aspirations and remain poor. The other strategy has been to try to place responsibility for changing the global economy on individuals. So if we're moral human beings, we will recycle our garbage and ride a bicycle to work. And when you think about it that way, it seems pretty ridiculous. And it's ridiculous particularly because of what's been called individualization and the fact of something called rebound effects, which I'll talk about for a minute. I'm just talking about the United States, but if every family recycled all of their paper, it would only affect about 15 or 20% of the paper consumed. Because industry, companies, commercial enterprises consume 80% of the paper, 72% of energy, 60% of food, and 96% of water. Yet, when there's a drought, the response is to tell everybody to kill their lawn and let their garden die. This is individualization. For the last 30 years, we've been told that more efficient machinery, more efficient cars are going to reduce consumption. And there's a lot of writing about this now, but the study on the left was done here in Mexico in Sonora. there was a program to replace refrigerators and air conditioners with new, more efficient models. And they looked at the effects, and people bought larger refrigerators. So their electricity consumption did not go down. When they got more efficient air conditioners, they put the temperature lower and used them more. There's a variety of rebound effect, which is when you take something that is ridiculously large, a large consumer of energy, and you produce a more efficient version. So that's like your more efficient yacht, or a 50-inch television that uses less than the previous model. Because people change their consumption when they save through efficiency. This just shows Europe, and it's looking at three things: efficiency, GDP, gross domestic product, and the materials that are used. And what you can see is that GDP goes up, efficiency goes up, and the use of materials stays about the same. This is specifically for gasoline for cars in the United States, automobiles. And what you see is that as cars become more efficient, people use them more. And in fact, total fuel consumption continues to rise. There's some other things that are happening in contemporary consumer culture. Fashion cycles are going much faster. I haven't even broken my iPhone 4, and already I'm being persuaded to go for a 6S. This has been an old, reliable means of increasing consumption. It's the conversion of durable products into disposable products. So for instance, I don't know if this has happened in Mexico yet, but in the US, when you wanted to clean the toilet, you had a brush that sat in a little plastic container next to the toilet, and you used that brush to clean the toilet, and then you put it back. But that's very unsanitary. Who knows how many people have died from infections? So now, instead, we're sold a plastic wand. They call it a wand, like a magic wand. And then you buy a box of little pads that have the soap in them, and you pick up the pad with the wand without touching anything. You have to wear gloves, I think. And then after you scrub the toilet, you press a button, and the little pad goes into the toilet and disappears. And these pads are completely resistant to decomposition. So 10,000 years from now, people will find whole layers of these toilet scrubber pads. And fortunately, we won't have to explain it to them. There's also a tremendous proliferation of choice going on in consumer capitalism. So years ago, when I think when I got my first car, there was a choice of 2 colors. And now, many companies are offering enough combinations so that it's impossible to count how many different combinations you could choose. And every good like this is pulling along behind it years and years of maintenance and spare parts, all of which have to be stocked and kept for 20 or 30 years to keep these things running. We already have countries like Japan and Singapore where it is illegal to keep your car more than 5 years. Then you have to sell it so it can go to some poorer country. Another thing that's happened is that the supply chains for goods have become so complicated that it's very difficult to even calculate what the environmental impact of a particular good might be. This is a pair of blue jeans, and those are all the steps, many of which are given off to subcontractors. The other problem that we're seeing now is that the figures that our politicians are giving based on a kind of lie, the displacement of impact. So this is for the UK, for the United Kingdom. And the blue line is their their greenhouse gas emissions over time. And you can see that they have actually managed to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. And they brag about this at international meetings. But if you add in the carbon dioxide that's released in creating the goods that they consume in other places, you get the red line. So they're buying their goods from China and then blaming China for having growing CO2 emissions. These are all wild estimates produced mainly by the industries themselves. There's nobody who actually counts CO2 emissions. It's all an abstract mathematical exercise. And this is about how individuals actually experience consumption. And it has also to do with the emergence of what's been called the green consumer. And it's based on this paradox that every religion in the world has been teaching people for thousands of years that greed is bad and that increasing your consumption is immoral. It's impossible to collect all of the religious teachings and proverbs that make this point about wealth and spending. Most every religion demands that you actually give things away to the poor. And it's not just religions. Marx didn't like consumption very much either. And then there's a kind of liberal critique that says that the pleasure of consumption is shallow. Whereas if you go and you listen to a concert of classical music, that's enriching. But if you are listening to hip hop, you're wasting your time. So there's a liberal critique that says that some pleasures are real and enlightening, and others are bad and fake and debasing. And then you have, of course, the new environmental critique, which says that, when you waste water, you're killing whales. So my question is, how is it that we agree so readily with all of these critiques of consumption, yet we manage to increase our consumption? Most of the environmental scientists who see this kind of inconsistency say that it's because people don't really believe it, or they're tempted by comforts and pleasures. So it's kind of, how can you save all this fuel by riding your bicycle to work, and then with the money you've saved, you fly to Cancun for the weekend and stay in a big air-conditioned hotel. So to answer this question, I did what every college professor usually does first. I did a survey of my students. And from talking to my students over the last few years, I've started to realize that people are in a dilemma where their pleasures are also moral hazards. So my students feel kind of torn between the virtue of going running in the morning and the pleasure of having chocolate cake after lunch. Psychologists, a very small group of psychologists have been studying this, and they call it moral accounting. So this is one of the essays written by my students. And I don't know if you can read it, but what the student is saying is that I spend a lot of time working and studying, and then I go off and I spend money on clothing and other material items, and I do things like going out drinking with my friends. So, and then she explains it. If I'm being good, I'll definitely want to be bad later. As one of my students said, I earned 500 calories this morning. So she says if she's made plans to be bad, like going out drinking or having unprotected sex, I will decide to engage in good behavior beforehand so that I can fully enjoy my indulgence without feeling guilty. If I eat a lot of good food after the bad food, she can balance the good food and the bad food. So like you had a very big breakfast, you have a little tiny lunch. And if you eat more of the good stuff, it makes the amount of bad stuff smaller in proportion. The point I'm trying to make here is that trying to restrain your consumption and trying to be good can lead to greater total consumption. This is something dieters have observed many times, and that is it's going back and forth between being on a diet and off a diet that makes you fat. So your attempt to restrain your consumption ends up increasing your total consumption. And marketers know this because in diet books, they will have some kind of low-calorie food on one page and then something called an indulgence on the next page. So this is, for me, a kind of very local, everyday form that shows us how consumption grows even as we try to control it. Let's see. This is another effect we've recently discovered, although I knew it all along, and that is that when you consume bad things in a big group, there's less guilt. But it doesn't work the other way. You can't, if you do good things with a lot of other people, you just get the same amount of virtue you would have had if you did it by yourself. So at this point, as I'm getting to the end of my lecture, usually somebody wants to ask me, so why should we try to engage in any kind of saving or green consumption if it really isn't going to make any difference? And what I would argue is that I don't ride my bicycle because I think it's going to save the whales or the planet or anything else. It's a statement of my values. And the way that individuals really do make a difference is when they try to influence their workplace or when they engage in a kind of action to try to push an industry to change its practices, and engage in the kinds of political practices that can lead to both local and larger scale changes in practices. Just in closing, I have to admit I still haven't made up my mind about this boycott movement. I don't know if you have it here in Mexico. It's an app. Yeah, it's an app.
Isn't it?
An app like what you put on your cell phone. You put in your values, and it tells you which companies are bad according to those values. So you can scan any item, and it will tell you how good it is or how bad it is. And I'm not sure whether that's really it leads to any kind of political action. But I just have to say, when I was doing research for images for this PowerPoint, I found this website in Canada which calculates how much better everything will get if you practice yogic flying through meditation. And I worry that this might be exactly the same kind of thing as drinking tap water instead of bottled water, those kinds of choices. Thank you for your patience and your time, and I hope